Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are doing part 2 of SAS Rogue Heroes, episodes 4 through 6. And we are lucky enough to have our special guest George back, who is full of way more exciting information about SAS Rogue Heroes. Welcome back, George.
Thank you for having me.
So we're just going to jump right into it. We'll start off talking about what happens in episode 4.
In episode 4, the war games, as we like to call them, continue. The guys split up into teams and go off on their raids. And also Paddy goes on a little quest to find Owen buried in the sand.
Paddy's quest to find Owen, this actually does happen. And it's absolutely heartbreaking in the show and in real life. There is a letter that Paddy writes to Owen's mother later, talking about how he had gone out looking for evidence. I'm not sure actually at this point in real life if he knows that Owen is dead, or because there's sort of some confusion as to whether he died or was taken prisoner. But obviously in the show, he's very definitely dead and passed on. But the thing I really love about this little scene where Paddy goes and he finds a spot where he feels he can feel Owen's presence, and instead of like reading poetry to him, which he says they've done before, he sings this really sort of funny song, which is actually a song called Slattery's Mounted Foot, which was by somebody called Percy French. And for me, I really love this because this is like emblematic of why SAS Rogue Heroes works, despite not being necessarily hugely historically accurate. They get the heart right. Paddy Mayne in real life was a Percy French fan. You know, there's a fantastic story about him parachuting into France with a portable gramophone strapped to his leg, from which he could play Percy French records. There's another story about him loaning his copy of Percy French's works to a nurse. We know that he was a fan. So to include a small detail like that amongst, you know, what are some sort of wildly incorrect bits of history, it does show that they care about Paddy, and it works so beautifully. And Jack O'Connell looks so tiny and so vulnerable in the desert. It makes me cry just thinking about it.
I just imagine kind of Paddy just playing the gramophone mid-air. I know that's not possible, but it just sounds so funny.
He'd be one of those guys these days that you see walking around with like the huge earphones all the time. Yeah, and I believe while this is happening, it's so funny the contrast. The other guys are going on their 5 days of leave, and so they go back to civilization. And this is where they're wearing the white berets, right? And they get into a big knockdown drag-out with everybody.
You do. Have I already forgotten the entire episode?
A lot happens this episode, I feel, because you've got the raids, you've got then, like, for me, it feels like it's 2 parts. So you've got all of this with like Paddy's quest, the leave in Cairo where they're wearing the white berets, and what's it he says? Reg gets taunted for like looking too fancy, like it's, and somebody puts it on and says, "Is it Ladies' Day Ascot?" or something like that. Hence the massive fight in Cairo.
And it's also alluded to that David gave them those white berets on purpose to get them sort of in a fighting spirit kind of thing later on in the episode. Which I thought was funny. I'm not sure if it was true or not.
Yeah, bonding exercise, I guess. We're all wearing these stupid hats together.
And they also used the beret to adopt Mike Sadler, which I feel possibly didn't happen quite that way. But they're just like, hand in a hat. You're one of us now.
Yeah.
So he moves from the Long Range Desert Group to the SAS. I love that. He looks so confused.
I love that too.
It's not all fun and games in this episode because on the way back from a raid, I believe, we lose Jock Lewis, and he dies as they're attacked by fighter planes, and he hallucinates his girlfriend Mirren, again with the hallucinations that seem to happen quite a lot in the show. And basically we lose one of our 3 main characters, I would say, to which Paddy then says to David, "Only the dreamer and the madman left," and I love that line.
It is really good, but I feel like we would be remiss not to mention the weird flashback where Jock is on a date with Mirren and they have awkward, uncomfortable sex in the back of his car. I was like, what am I watching?
Yeah. No, I could have lived without thinking about that again. It's so awkward.
He also proposes at the very same moment, which is strange.
Right. And then in the show, of course, he is killed and they had to leave his body. They couldn't recover it. They were being attacked, which was the whole thing. And then after he dies, he gets a letter back from Mirren saying, "Yeah, of course I'll marry you." And it's very sad.
And I also think that's true, if I remember the dates correctly. There
I
is a
think
letter from Mirren accepting.
it was true. I think they say in the documentary that we also watched, I think it's his nephew or something who wrote his biography, and he says they did receive the letter later after he was already dead, which is so sad. It's when David gets back to the camp and learns that Jock is dead, we kind of get introduced to him as being this really emotional character, and I like that they show that side of him, because often in war shows it's all like bravado and tough guys, but David is really sad, and I like that they show that too. And I believe they go into mourning for a bit. They mention mourning and that the mourning period is over.
Well, the flag's at half-mast too. That's where that Reg Johnny scene comes from, because they're trying to raise the flag back up, I believe.
Right, that's true. And I wrote down a line that David says. He says, "Fuck wheels, fuck ropes, let's just tie the fucking thing," about the flag, which I think is kind of a nod to not having to do everything the way you're supposed to do it, as long as you get it done.
Right, with a certain degree of slapdashedness in there, for sure. Maybe we cut corners, but we get the job done.
Yeah, exactly. It's very David Sterling.
Yeah, this whole story is very obviously steeped in like machismo and like this masculinity and all that stuff. But I agree. I did like that the emotional beats that they hit hard. You know, Patty's grief over Owen and Sterling's reaction to Jock's death and some other things that happened later. And it's just nice to see that even though this is a high adventure story, the like outlaws sort of the thing, it's also these are real people having real emotional reactions. I think that's what makes it like elevates it, you know?
Absolutely. I think there's a lovely scene where David is talking to the men. It's the beret scene where they get handed out, and he's talking about the new jump wings they also get that were designed by Jock. And he gives one to Jim Elmans, who was obviously one of Jock's closest friends and allies within the SAS. And you can see him sort of essentially just shaking and trying to hold back tears. And it's such a beautiful, quiet moment of love and respect, I think.
Yeah. We also have in this episode, I mean, we noted before that Sterling and Eve Mansour had struck up an ongoing romantic relationship. So I think we get a little bit more of that in this episode too. Sterling ends up being told that 20 free French paratroopers will be joining the SAS. And this is positioned in the show as Eve's idea, which she sort of puts one over on him. She puts him in a situation where he can't really say no. And he's not very open to the idea at first, which I believe is not quite what happened in real life, but it's good because it gives Eve something to do in the plot of the show. So the 20 free French paratroopers are led by Captain Georges Berger, as played by Virgilie Bramley. And Sterling gives Patty the job of training the French soldiers to fight in the desert, which Patty aptly notes that Sterling is probably doing so that he can jump up his score in this game that they're playing in terms of how many planes, etc., that they can destroy, while Patty is stuck behind training these Frenchmen.
David also says something here that his father taught him to win in any way possible, and he kind of attributes it to that, I think.
This is another example of how obviously what the SAS is doing, this like ground sabotage, in previous wars would have been considered ungentlemanly and it wouldn't really have been done. So it's just more of these tactics that we see Sterling even employ in his personal life, where he's not above getting his hands dirty a little if that's what it takes to win.
And then we kind of move on to episode 5, where we left off. And we see Betty training the free French, to jump in the desert. There is also the very famous sand wrestling scene between Betty and another soldier called Augustin Jourdain, played by César Domboy. And it's interesting, to say the least. And also there is a touching moment between Betty and a Jewish French soldier called Alevé. Otherwise, the training is as strange as you've come to expect from Betty Main. And he also plays a game of roulette with Augustin. So I think he welcomes death at this point. He's got like this strange relationship with death this entire show, but in this episode, it's especially prevalent.
Yeah, he said something in that scene where he goes to find Owen's body in the desert, where he talks about it would be nice to be a coward, to love life that much. It's worth mentioning in this scene that he's just being an asshole. The French he assigns them this task of building these two towers so they can practice jumping off them, these big 30-foot towers, which I mean, the use of jumping off a 30-foot tower as parachute training dubious in the first place, but he splits them into two teams where he forces them to split up between the actual quote unquote Frenchmen and then the members who are not from France. So they have some members from Africa. They have these two German guys. They have, of course, the Frenchman who is Jewish. So they're dividing them in this way, which the French don't really want to be divided in that way. And the whole time they're building it, he's shooting at them. And so just not being very easy to get along with. Deliberately, Sterling gives him this job and Patty's like, "Oh yeah, watch me." So just his behavior in this is very, I mean, even before the roulette thing, you can tell that he's hanging out by his fingernails a little bit, from this grief that he's experiencing. And he ends up ratcheting it up another notch that evening when all the French are celebrating around the piano and they're not being very gentle with the piano. And as we know, Patty has this emotional attachment to the piano because of Owen. So he ends up attacking Sergeant Walter Essner, as played by Paul Bosch, and he's one of the two German members of the Free French paratroopers in a drunken brawl.
And it's Augustin who says to him, "It's just a piano," right before the brawl starts. And I think that's the reason he starts fighting. Because obviously the piano means more to him than just being a piano. It's his memory of Owen, I think.
Yeah, I think you couldn't design a single worse thing to have said to Paddy Mayne at that particular moment than "it's just a piano" to set him up. There is a really interesting moment at the end of the brawl where Augustin sort of realizes that Paddy isn't doing what he's doing because he's just a dick. He's got some kind of deep-seated grief. He says, what is it, "Captain Mayne, whatever is the source of your pain." I can't remember how he finishes that sentence, but he's like, I wish you can resolve it, is essentially the thrust of what he's saying. And I think that's quite beautiful, and it gives quite a lot of depth to that character as well, which is not easy to do. We're 5 episodes into a 6-episode series. So we've got this strong relationship between those two men with the sand wrestling and the roulette scene, and now this. It really puts a weight on it, I think.
Yeah, this show does a good job of giving you at least something tangible about pretty much each sort of named member. It's, you can be like, all right, well, I kind of have a vibe for what Johnny is like, and I have a vibe for what Reg is like. So the series is pretty good at giving you these brief moments where later you can be like, okay, yeah, I do know that about this person, or I do know that about this relationship. So after this is where we have the raid on Benghazi, which is almost fully fictionalized for the show, except for the part where Randolph Churchill, played by Ian Davies, accompanies them. In the show, they go there, they get through the checkpoint, they wait until nightfall, and then they almost get caught getting out of the city. It's kind of a goof 'em up, but maybe George, you could tell us a bit about what it was like in real life, or what it should have been like.
Because I blanked on it. Oh no. I was thinking about the earlier raid, which is what it's conflated with. So the Benghazi raid does not go well in many, many ways. It's a massive failure. What they're showing in the show is, I think, a raid on a different port that was successful, that took place a little bit earlier, but it was successful, but ultimately much less significant the place was much less significant ultimately than it would have been at Benghazi, due to the way that the port at Benghazi had changed hands pretty much in the time it took to plan and go out on this earlier raid. But I can't tell you anything about Benghazi. I've just lost all that information.
Yeah, so the reason why they went to attack Benghazi is because I believe the Allies were making another attempt this was another situation where the Allies and the Axis were push-pulling over Tobruk. And so in the background of that, the SAS decided, okay, well, we're going to go attack this port at Benghazi because if we can sabotage the Axis powers, then it'll make it harder for them to participate kind of in this other area. And it went extremely poorly. They lost some guys. A bunch of guys were seriously wounded. There's a doctor. What was his name? Something Playdell? George
Malcolm Playdell.
Malcolm Playdell. And he's not in the show, but he did play a significant role. This is kind of where he got his hands dirty, and he was helping a lot of people who ended up being wounded or killed in this Benghazi raid. So another one where they suffered heavy casualties. It was very bloody.
Is this the one where Jim Ullman's gets taken prisoner?
It could be.
I don't know.
It's in a raid on Benghazi that Jim Ullman's gets taken prisoner.
In real life.
In real life, not in the show.
Right.
I need to check timelines there.
But in the show, the Benghazi raid is successful, and they go back, and Randolph Churchill is pretty impressed, which ends up being pretty important for a meeting later on that David has with the big Mr. Churchill. And somehow Eve has figured out that Randolph Churchill is with them, and she shows up to their rendezvous point. And this episode ends with a scene where David goes to find Patty Mayne in his tent after he's been told that Patty's become a little bit unruly. And they speak about Owen, and David tells him to forget about him. And then there's this line from David that I really liked, where he says, "No one can bear undeclared grief," which I thought was pretty.
Yeah, that scene is really lovely. I think their relationship is so fascinating to me because they obviously in so many ways like bounce off of each other. They don't get along. Like I just can't imagine them being friends if they had met, in different circumstances, but they just understand each other on a pretty deep level, I think.
Yeah, like at their lowest moments, each of them, they find each other and can talk to each other, I think. We see it earlier when Paddy goes to him after Jock dies, and it's quite a soft moment from Paddy. He doesn't, say anything, but just like only the madman and the dreamer left. He's just standing there to support David. It's lovely. And again, I think this is based on something that reportedly occurred in real life, where they finally got into it and they opened up to each other, and nobody knows what was said, I think, in detail.
Probably not this, but maybe probably something like this. It.
But they did apparently speak about Owen McGonagall, so that is interesting.
Yeah, yes. I don't obviously know anywhere near as much about Paddy as you do, but based on what we see from him in the show, I feel like it would be hard to know him and not know that he had taken a body blow. I mean, it's written in everything that he does after Owen dies.
Absolutely. There is, way back, there's a Paddy Mayne biography, and Owen and Paddy, I think, had interacted with, during training, they were close. But there is a letter from somebody to the biographer of Paddy Mayne's biography, written so many years later, that says, like, "Oh, I can't really tell you that much about Paddy. We didn't have him to the house because he was too wild for me." But then says, whatever happened to his running mate, Owen McGonagall? And this is decades after the two of them have passed through her life, that she still had in her head, "Oh, I'm thinking about Paddy Mayne. I'm also thinking about Owen McGonagall." And that, to me, is quite intensely indicative of how close that relationship was.
Yeah. So Sterling tells Paddy that he has to apologize to the Free French for being a dick, quite rightly. And Paddy says that he won't do that, but he shot a gazelle and he'll cook it so everyone can eat it. And that's how the Free French and the Rogue Heroes break bread together and make their peace. And that's kind of how the episode closes out.
Episode 6 opens with a radio message indicating the fall of Tobruk in the summer of 1942. As we explained in our summary of the North Africa campaign in our previous episode, we are with Eve and David, with Eve tending to David's desert sores, which are really gross. And Eva briefly mentions marriage. She kind of shoots him down and says, "Listen, buddy, there's a war on. We don't have time for this."
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like in a lot of the war media I've seen that is based on real people and you read up on them in real life, so many dudes got married on short leaves to women they had met twice. Just this heightened sense of, oh, anything could happen. I could die. I want to get married before that happens. There seems to be this like impulse to jump into that sort of thing.
I think that's probably quite natural. And I think actually even Jock and Mirren, they'd only met a handful of times before this intense love affair, and then he proposes through letters.
Yeah. So Sterling has a successful meeting with Winston Churchill to get more support for the SAS. In the show, they depict it as Churchill knowingly giving him carte blanche. I believe in real life, the story was a bit less clear on that front. It seems like Sterling got Churchill's signature as an autograph or something, and then essentially used that signature to be like, look, you have to help us and give us whatever we want.
We actually see him typing out a little message on the autographed piece of paper that says, "Please give carrier of this message any possible assistance," or something like that. And I think there must have been the actual message on the note.
Yeah. This is another, I think, in real life Sterling tale. So maybe we don't 100% know if it's true, but it's a fun story.
I think that's
That's
true of quite
true.
a lot of what Sterling said, right? Like, it could be true, but
Yeah, we had talked a little bit about this online. It's funny. The Mart and I had watched, I don't know if you got a chance to dig into it, George, but there was this documentary that they made, I think in 2016 or whenever the McIntyre book came out. It was like a documentary where Ben McIntyre was sort of the host, and it was all about the formation of the SAS. And so many of the things he would say, he would say, oh, well, this particular thing happened or whatever. And then at the end, it's like, but we only have Sterling's word to go on. And he was a bit of a embellisher and a tall tale teller. And part of, I think, the reason why the historical inaccuracy sits a bit easier in this show is because that's kind of part and parcel of the legend of the SAS. We don't even really know what the actual historical record is because the way these guys live was larger than life, and the tales they told coming out of it, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
and I think that's also part of the ongoing appeal of the SAS. So, for a very secretive organization, there are a lot of books written about the SAS and a lot of people giving their opinions, a lot of stories, and a lot of them conflict. If you start going through, it's very hard to pin down a very accurate timeline of who was what and who did what when. I think that's fascinating. I think that's why it's almost romantic in a way to just try and put together all of these stories into one cohesive narrative. And SAS Rogue Heroes is just one part of that. Like, okay, here's another story we can try and tell about the SAS.
Right. I think part of the appeal to them is the fact that were so mythical and there were so many legends, and that's why it's so fun too.
So next we have the rugby scene where it seems that the Rogue Heroes and the Free French have made up because they're playing some rugby with each other in the desert sand. George, you want to talk about how Paddy Mayne was a rugby player?
Oh God, I forgot I put this in. The rugby scene delights me because Paddy Mayne was a rugby player. He played internationally prior to the war. And in this scene, I think, I can't remember who it is who tackles him, but he just sort of goes down like a ton of bricks, gets into a fight. Mike Sadler's pulling him off, like, out of this fight. And then he pulls out a gun and starts shooting, which is exactly how you play rugby, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And then after that, Dr. Cornell shows up to inspect the men to see if they are fit to go on the next missions, because all of them basically have desert sores. And you see Paddy just refusing to wear the little ribbon saying he needs treatment, which I feel is very in character for her.
Also, desert sores are super gross, and I don't think anyone should look into them unless you have to, because I have, and I wish I didn't have any of this knowledge in my head. And the treatment, also unpleasant. They do get into it in the show.
I wish I didn't have any of this knowledge in my head is so often my motto when I go down a rabbit hole of research.
Don't they say it needs like scraping or something?
Yeah.
It sounds like herbal. Let's just not talk about this.
So these two Allied convoys need to get through to Malta. Malta was the base for a lot of British shipping. They had an airfield. Like, it was a super vital point for the Allies to hold on to, especially once Tobruk had fallen. And so the team plans a raid in support of that at 6 air bases, including on Crete. And these raids, we have some mixed successes here.
Mixed is a very good way of putting it. So in Crete specifically, we've got Berger, he goes, and that's when he gets captured. And there's, I think, a title screen that gives the exact date, June 19th, I think it is.
Yep.
So obviously that's not very successful. He eventually goes to Colditz. But the very big, oh gosh, what's the word? the Jordan's
Clusterfuck?
group. Yeah, clusterfuck might be the word.
We can swear on this podcast because I made Mart rated explicit so that I could drop the F-bomb sometimes.
Oh, thank God. Because I think the only way to describe, I think the other two raids are clusterfuck. Really, Jordan's group are betrayed by a member of their own party, and eventually all of them are killed because they are captured, apart from Jordan, because they are captured, and one of them, Halevi, sacrifices himself.
The Jewish French guy. And it's kind of important because one of the Germans that captures them says something about get out of the truck or join your dead family or something. And then he blows up the truck and everybody else except for Jordan.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in because at no point have we said his full name or the actor who plays him. He was Aspirant Marc Halevi, played by Arthur Orsier, and I don't think that he was a real person. He might have been like an amalgam of real people. But it's worth noting also that when they had built the parachute training jump thing earlier, he hadn't wanted to jump off the top. And the way to motivate him to jump off was, like think of your family, because his family had all been killed by the Germans. And so when he's in the truck and the Germans taunting him that he's going to be dead like his family, that once again is kind of the catalyst that makes him act. And it's heartbreaking.
It's also good to note that they are betrayed by one of the two Germans, and it's the one, like, Betty has been suspicious of this one of the two Germans, but it's the wrong one. He's been suspicious of the other one, but the one that ends up betraying them is Corporal Herbert Bergner, played by Moritz Jahn.
Yeah. And then Sterling's raid itself is quote unquote successful, but he ends up killing a bunch of unarmed men. And he immediately regrets it. And it's funny because earlier in the show, he had razzed Patty for doing the same thing, essentially. And then after he does it, Patty says, "We drink from the same well after all." So you can see how the war, and as we know what they've been doing, sort of impacts them as they go on.
Can I just quickly jump in on Halevi?
Sure.
So he was an amalgam of multiple people. So he doesn't exist, but there were two men. One was Germain Gerpion, who was, quote, probably the least soldierly man in the detachment. So he couldn't run, he couldn't jump, he was terrified of heights, but he was incredibly brave and indomitable. But the guy on the raid was this other gentleman called Peter Haas, who was himself Jewish and then did blow them up in the way that we see in the show.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't know any of that. That's cool. So Sterling returns to Cairo and finds out that Eve has been killed on a flight back from Alexandria, and he takes it about as well as you might expect.
Yes, and it's kind of sad because he'd wanted to celebrate with Eve the fact that Al Detachment had become a real regiment. At that point, they'd proven themselves enough. And he says something about that too, like, right when we had something to celebrate, he seems struggle through his grief, and he returns to the base, and he and Betty share another drink. But he seems really kind of, I don't know the word I'm trying to use. Sad, but not sad. It's when you stop caring about stuff.
Yeah, I know what you mean. He goes up to drink by himself, and Patty follows, and they share a drink. And I thought it was good of Patty not to parrot back in his face. No one can bear undeclared grief, David. Now you know what it's like to lose somebody. Yeah. George, do you want to elaborate on do not think about the timeline too hard in this episode?
Yeah, so all the way through SAS Rogue Heroes, the timeline is interesting. I think particularly in this one, we do see events that get sort of conflated together. So, for instance, the raids on the ports, one of which is Benghazi, these take place, I think, months apart, but become one. We jump around, I think, from June, and then we see something else that takes place in sort of October time, September time. And if you try and plot them on a map, it does not work with the episode at all. So we're not going to bother. And I think that's fine. We hit the highlights, we know vaguely what happens, and we know the emotional beats. And I think for SAS Rogue Heroes, that's fine.
Right. Yeah. So Operation Torch, as we discussed in our summary of the North African campaign in the first episode, that was in 1942 when the Americans landed and finally got involved in this theater of war. And so, in the backdrop of this happening, Sterling is trying to find a route for the American and British armies to meet. And he ends up getting arrested, and it's a very high stakes situation. He's there with, I think, Mike Sadler and Johnny Cooper, and they manage to get away. And there's a minute where Sterling is pointing his pistol at the Germans and they're telling him to drop the gun, and he's behaving in a way that's quite, you think, oh, maybe he's gonna, maybe this is gonna be like suicide by German. But he ends up, no, he lowers his gun and he ends up being arrested.
It was vaguely reminiscent of Betty Main, actually. It was just kind of like enjoying the idea of maybe not surviving.
Right. And it also kind of echoes after Jock's death when there's the spilled gasoline on the ground and he's going to light a cigarette and they're yelling at him not to light the cigarette, where it's, not maybe as intentional as putting a gun in your mouth, but there's still this self-destructive impulse.
But he does get taken prisoner, and he's kind of being driven away on a truck. And as he is being driven away, we get a little Vera Lynn song, Wish Me Luck as You Wave Me Goodbye. It's kind of this little cheeky little music moment again.
Right. It's quite a jaunty little tune. It is funny. And I believe in real life, this whole, high stakes interaction didn't even happen. I think Sterling was caught asleep in the desert and hadn't bothered to post any sentries in typical slapdash Sterling fashion.
But that's not heroic enough, though, for this show.
Certainly would not have given us the same emotional beat, so.
And the episode ends with Maine being promoted and being put in charge of SAS. And he says,
"Now the blood will flow."
I knew George would know it.
It's very cool. It's not normal.
I think we should talk about what we're likely to see next season based on the history, based on what we know about the show and production. I think it's been filmed already and they're in post right now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think they finished filming sometime last year, and we could see it towards the end of this year or next year. We don't know. We haven't got a release date yet.
I think you have some notes in here, George.
This is from the BBC press release. With David Sterling captured and Paddy Mayne now in charge of the SAS, their attention must turn from the conflict in North Africa to mainland Europe. But GHQ have cast doubt over the future of the regiment, while the creation of a new unit and a surprise arrival makes things even more difficult for the men. Can they prove that the SAS remains essential to the war wherever it may lead them?
Yeah, so just super broad strokes, I guess. Obviously, we know that after North Africa, the SAS goes on to participate in the war in Italy. I don't know if you want to get into a bit more detail, George?
Yeah, this is really like a time of transition for the SAS. So you've got this little unit that they were in North Africa, which is quite a small thing. And as soon as we start moving into Europe, there's a new unit that comes up, the 2nd SAS, which is put together by Bill Sterling. And that's in, I think, 1943 that comes into fruition, who joins them in Sicily. And then as they progress through Europe, more and more SAS and SAS adjacent units start being formed around them. So you're seeing sort of this little web of nations coming out from it. So I think, from what I've heard, that Series 2 is really intended to focus on their activity in Sicily and Italy, whereas potentially further down the line, we're seeing more of the operations in France. But again, this is in Italy, they're doing something very different from what we've seen in the show so far. So where they've been on sort of raids into like air bases and attacking things at night and sort of damage, essentially. In Italy, they start by essentially going in to capture the ports, more sort of traditional commando style warfare. And so that's something, very different that we've seen from the lads so far.
I didn't know this until tonight, but I saw that David's brother is going to be played by Gwyneth Lee, who's one of my all-time favorite actors. So I'm excited for that.
So good to hear. I'm assuming that it's Bill Sterling, who they're referring to by the creation of a new unit and a surprise arrival.
Yeah, that's exciting. Looking forward to that.
It'll be interesting to see, I guess, how much they cover, because up until D-Day, I think the Allied invasion of Sicily was the largest amphibious landing in history, if I'm not mistaken. And I also feel that kind of similar to the North African campaign, it's maybe a bit less well known. Like if people are listing the highlights of World War II who don't know much about it, it might not come up. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that. I think they capture the port of Termoli, so that'll probably come up in the show. That's one of the ones that was really bloody and they had a lot of casualties.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's in the McIntyre that there's a quote from Reg Seekings saying that Timberley was horrible or terrible, and that's just like the simple phrase speaks volumes. And then it sounded like a very brutal time. But the other thing sorry,
I wonder how the combat is going to be different. Like, I don't think I know exactly what commando style warfare is. I don't know if either of you know more about that, but
this is what they're doing in Sicily and Italy. That I actually do have a timeline. Let me figure this out. So in July, they invade Sicily, and this is sort of an amphibious landing on a beach. They take out defenses at Capomuro di Porco. My pronunciation remains not good.
Nailed it.
Before they move up the coast and they secure the port of Augusta. So again, they're going in and they are taking control of this port rather than sort of just act as a raid and retreating again.
And they wouldn't be as much like in the shadows and escaping, but staying there instead.
Exactly. Basically. They actually stay in Augusta for like a month before they go on.
Yeah, they're just taking on sort of smaller missions that more specialized army groups would take on. Should we talk about how the groups are likely to be split up or how the characters are likely to be split up?
Well, I don't know here because there's a really interesting thing about the Italy section of the SAS history in that a lot of the people that we know are going to be involved in the second series are not necessarily there. So we know that Johnny Cooper is appearing in season 2. He's actually away for officer training. All through this, he takes no role in any of the action in 1943, the tail end of 1943. Jim Ullman's at some point is taken as a prisoner of war, and he rejoins them after the Italian campaign is over. So he actually, I think it's at the end of the time in Italy, Jim Ullman's then goes back to the UK, where he's given a job as head of security at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. And then Paddy Mayne directly intervenes and gets his boy back. So he's not there, but we know that Jim Ullman's is there in the show, or, at least Corin Silver's been filming with them. And then Dave Kershaw goes as a training officer to join the 2nd SAS. So he could be there, but possibly with Bill Sterling instead of Paddy Mayne. So, yeah.
Right, so they might be streamlining some more, is what you're saying.
I suspect there'll be an element of streamlining and bringing in people together that may not be as entirely accurate to real life.
And no Mike Sadler this season.
No
Mike Sadler. To be fair, this is also, I think, true to history. So I think Mike Sadler stays as a navigator for the 8th Army for a while, and then at some point goes off to the States, and I'm not entirely certain of the dates on that. But you sort of lose track of his history in a lot of these books until France again. So, yeah, we know that Tom Dingani was filming House of the Dragon. So what are you going to do?
Also cool. Like, you have to pick your cool shows, I guess.
Yeah, he picked wrong. No, that's not true. House of the Dragon is very cool.
Can you talk a bit about some of these characters I see you've listed as potentially new characters that we're going to see?
Yeah, so we've got at least 4 new named characters. Bill Sterling we've already talked about. So there are 2 SAS members who are joining the cast this season. So we've got John Tonkin, who's played by Jack Barton. So he was a member of the Long Range Desert Group who joins the SAS in 1942. So I guess he's been there all along, or at least at the end of the last series, but we just haven't met him yet. And what's interesting about him is that he remains with the SAS throughout to the end of the war. And he's one of the guys who goes with Paddy and Mike when they join the British Antarctic Survey. It's the 3 of them. And the other very specific, interesting bit for this podcast that I think I would have to mention is at one point, just before an operation in France, he does meet Violette Sabo.
Yay, Violette!
Cool.
Friend of the pod.
I thought that would please you.
Very much.
So the other characters we know we're getting is Jock McDiarmid. Again, he was in the SAS prior to the end of the last series, but we haven't seen him, so he's being played by Mark Rowley, so presumably he's getting a bigger role, or a significant role this season. And we've got Connor Neal, who's playing Montgomery. What he will be doing in the series, I'm not sure, but that's a very exciting piece of casting news. And then we've also got an unnamed so far female character, named Anna Manueli. But again, we don't have a name. We don't know what she will be doing in the show, but it is very exciting to see another named woman. Or presumably,
You might not have lines, is what you're saying.
Well, I don't think they would announce or whatever that she was in it if she didn't have lines. So hopefully she's an actual character and not a hat rack.
Hopefully.
I'm hopeful. So yeah, so those are the new characters. And I think almost everybody still alive at the end of last series, apart from Mike Sadler, should be also making an appearance.
Yeah, that should be fun. And we know that Sterling, of course, was captured at the end of the last series in January of 1943. And apparently he kept escaping and being kind of a pain in the ass. So they moved him to Colditz Castle, which supposedly was escape proof. And I went down a little rabbit hole.
Tell us about the rabbit
What
hole.
else?
Just like a strange vibes. So it's almost like a summer camp situation, except they're not allowed to leave. So I guess at the camp, they were following the Geneva Convention. So if you got caught escaping, they wouldn't kill you. And the guards would basically just form these gentlemen's agreements with the prisoners. They'd be like, oh, you want to put on a theatrical show? Here's a bunch of tools you can use. Just promise you won't use them to escape. And then, of course, the prisoners would try to use them to escape. And they actually gave the prisoners their Red Cross packages, which is a stark contrast to what Louis Zamperini went through in the Pacific Theater, which we covered in Unbroken. So oftentimes the prisoners ate better than the guards, and then they would trade their food for money that they would later use in escape attempts.
I would like to interject and say I would like to input a little bit of music here. Please insert Hotel California.
Yeah, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, except for all the people who did end up escaping from COVID. And I just wanted to give a little shout out because in October 1940, there were 3 men who became the first British prisoners at Colditz, well, quote unquote British, part of the Commonwealth. And one of them was Howard Wardle, who was a Canadian pilot who joined the RAF right before the war, which a lot of Canadian pilots did, including my great uncle, actually. And he's notable for being one of only 2 men who escaped from both Colditz and Spangenberg prison during World War II. So he escaped from Spangenberg first, and then he was sent to Colditz, and then he escaped again for good. And he just got completely away, and they never caught him. So just wanted to give a little Canada shout out.
Cool. What's this I see about a Dutch Hawaiian band?
The prisoners all had their little hobbies. So there was a Dutch Hawaiian guitar band. They had Camp Olympics. They did all kinds of just little activities. They made moonshine. Apparently one guy made a sparkling wine that made you go temporarily blind. They called this Jam Happy, and it did not prevent them from drinking it. And they made a hobby out of harassing the guards. So they would throw water bombs at them. They would be a nuisance and not be paying attention during roll call and deliberately just be a hassle while that was going on. And they just didn't seem to get in too much trouble for it. I don't know. It's just such a strange vibe. And I gather they hid radios and moonshine stills all around the camp, and they hid them so well that one radio wasn't found until a prisoner went back in the 60s and got it. And some tourists actually found a hidden moonshine still in the 80s.
Wow.
Yeah.
They sound kind of like a couple of teens just being annoying in this camp.
Literally. This camp also had a lot of famous prisoners in it. So Churchill's wife's nephew was kept there as a political prisoner, nephews of the King and Queen of England, the son of Field Marshal Douglas Haig, a ton of generals, including the Polish commander of the Warsaw Uprising. So they have all these famous prisoners there. And I guess the famous captives had already been moved out before the end of the war. And the guy who ensured that they got to the Allied lines safely, this SS guy, this was actually the reason why his war crime sentence was lessened. He only did 6 years or something after the Nuremberg trials because he specifically ensured that all these famous prisoners escaped unharmed, basically, at the end of the war.
That's smart of him, I guess.
Him, yeah. But because in the spring of 1945, the prisoners were worried that the SS would enter the camp before the Americans could get there. So they actually persuaded the German guards to surrender to them before that could happen. But at that time, the famous captives had already been moved out because this SS guy already kind of foresaw that might be an issue.
Right, so yeah, foresight was very useful to him personally, I guess.
Yeah.
So, question, do we think, is David Sterling actually listed as a character in the second season?
Yes.
So
And
we're going to
he's
see
filmed
him.
something. So we should
Right.
some have called it.
Cool.
What I find a little interesting is that none of the French characters are returning, as far as I know. And two of them also went to Colditz. Berger and Augustin Jourdan both were at Colditz at some point.
Sad.
But there is a small casting spoiler, which is very interesting, which
I know the one.
is Sophia Boutella is appearing as Eve Mansour in season 2.
Oh my goodness. You mean she didn't die in the plane crash?
Or did she? No, we're just seeing some
Didn't
hallucinations.
see a body. Never trust it if you don't see the body.
Yeah. Well, I guess, y'all, could they really get away with fridging the only female character? That doesn't seem like that would be in order in this year of our Lord 2024.
I don't know, maybe.
Maybe, I mean, they've got another one. So it could be like one season they were allowed, one alive woman.
I mean, I guess she could be in flashbacks or whatever. We don't know for sure. But I hope
Yeah.
that she. So I think I saw some commentary from Stephen Knight saying that they have potentially plans for a few more seasons. So we might get to see like training to stop German reinforcements from reaching the front line during the Normandy invasion. We might get to see them working with like the French resistance, the Italian resistance, that kind of stuff. They had obviously a lot of operations in Europe that were super risky, where a lot of guys got captured and executed. So lots more high stakes stuff if they do end up having a few more seasons.
Yeah, I would be up for a few more seasons. I really enjoyed this show. So I'm excited for that.
I think he said something like another 3. So I don't know if he meant 3 seasons or 4 seasons. But I would be down. I would be down for 4 seasons.
Hopefully they can keep that that fun spark that the show has,
Yeah, I hope so too.
Should we talk about our little playlist that we made? Mart, I'll leave that up to you.
I was just opening my Spotify as you said that. So
Oh yeah, I went into the fugue state and I added things.
well done. So what we did is we created a little playlist on Spotify to kind of put our little wish list in for future soundtrack. And we each added a couple of songs to it. I think I ended up being the one who made least of them. But that's okay, because the music is such a big part of this show, and I feel like they have lots of opportunities to have good music in the next season. So I added quite a couple old songs. I added a T-Rex song called Get It On and the Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin. You guys want to mention some?
Both bangers.
I feel like my choices were based purely on vibes. So they're a bit more recent than a lot of music in the show, but I have stuff on here by The Offspring, Fall Out Boy, The White Stripes. I Predict a Riot by the Kaiser Chiefs, of course. And
Very good.
yes, and I put a couple of songs by anarchic women on there. So we got some Metric, some Florence and the Machine. So yeah, I think this playlist is exactly an hour. So it's the perfect playlist to throw on if you want to. The other day I went down and I did a workout. I hit the heavy bag and it was perfect vibes for that.
That sounds cool. What did you add, George?
Oh, so one of my favorite songs in the world is Alone Again or by the band Love. But that's a bit too psychedelic for this. So there's another version by The Damned, who I think appeared twice on season 1, which is a fantastic cover. And I just have this like vision of David Sterling in Colditz with this particular song. And then there's the slightly more obvious song by the Rezillos that I added, which is called Somebody's Gonna Get Their Head Kicked In Tonight, which is just a banger. And it's mostly what it sounds like. This music is completely up my alley. And I like you, Sam, I needed women on that playlist. So we've got Bad Reputation by Joan Jett.
I wish we could play some of it, but I think we would get sued for playing music on the podcast.
Well, listen, if there are enough people listening to this for us to get sued, then I think we made it. So
I will definitely link the entire playlist to the description of this podcast so you can listen to it yourself. And if you want to, you can add more songs.
hell yeah.
Fun.
I love it.
So let's, long last, talk about some of George's book recs, which I've been really excited about.
I was so good, you guys. I limited it so much, and it's not going to sound like I limited myself at all, but I was ruthless. So I went through the stack of books that I've actually piled up next to me, and it's quite terrifyingly tall. So I'm not going to look at it anymore. There are a couple of things I want to say up front. One, what I didn't include on here was the book SAS Rogue Heroes by Ben McIntyre, because you should definitely read that, because it is the most fantastic intro to all of this history. I love Ben McIntyre. I think I've said that multiple times. I think he's a fantastic writer. He's also got a book on Colditz, which I haven't read all of yet, but I have dipped into. And again, it's brilliant. So please read those.
Yeah, they have it at my library, and it's definitely on my list to get out. And I did read that you had talked about the Eddie Chapman book. I've read that one too, the Agent Zigzag. That was really good. And I think, didn't he also write Operation Mincemeat, which I haven't read, but I hear is good?
Operation Mincemeat and A Spy Amongst Friends, which is about Kim Philby, and that I think also got made into a series, which is so good.
Nice.
The other person who doesn't appear on this list, and it's not because he's not great, it's because he's so good and he's written so much about the SAS, is Damian Lewis. Any given Damian Lewis book about the SAS is worth reading. Just like find the name Paddy Mayne or Bill Fraser or whoever it is on the back of the book, pick it up, and it's going to be a great time.
Not to be confused with the actor Damian Lewis, by the way.
Not to be confused with the actor Damian Lewis.
Although, wouldn't it be fun if they were the same person? Have we ever seen both Damian Lewises in the same room at the same time? I'm just saying.
That's true. I don't think I've ever seen one Damian Lewis in the room, so.
Yeah, me either, to be fair.
You can do a lot of things with green screen these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I've got my actual recs now, and I had to, oh my goodness, I had to break these into sections so I could remember what they were. So I've got, in general overviews of the origins of the SAS, I have two. I have Speed, Aggression, Surprise, The Secret Origins of the Special Air Service by Tom Petch, which really focuses on the early days of the SAS, particularly the original idea of it and then sort of the North Africa campaign. And it really focuses on the role of Dudley Clark. So we get a lot more information about him. And we also get a lot more information about Bill Fraser, who I think has been sort of historically left out a bit from the narrative. He's much more, a big presence in more modern books about the SAS, but I think earlier on he didn't have quite as much focus. So that book is absolutely fantastic to dig into those characters. There is another book that's just come out recently about Dudley Clark called The Illusionist, I believe, and I've completely blanked on the author's name, but I haven't read that, but I think that's probably also worth a read. I'm going to be cheating throughout this, if you can't tell, by just sliding in other books.
I'm going to start counting them. I'm going to count them over here.
Count on, you'll run out of fingers. So the other great overview book is by Joshua Levine. It's SAS, is the illustrated history of the SAS. So it's quite light on, or not light on deep on text. It's still quite a dense book, but it has a lot of photographs and reproductions of articles and other material inside of it. Then that takes all through the original SAS, so from the North African campaign through Italy, through to France, towards the end of the war. And the really lovely thing about that book is the foreword is by Mike Sadler, and Mike Sadler is present throughout the book. It really focuses a lot on like personal memories, personal testimonies. So you get a real sort of intimate sense of the history as we move through. And one thing that actually really moved me, I was reading back it earlier this week, is that it closes with pictures of Mike Sadler as a young man and as an older gentleman saying, as of the time of this writing, Mike Sadler was 103. He's the last survivor. And, we're grateful to for his assistance in putting this book together. It wouldn't exist without him. And of course, this came out just before Mike Sadler passed away. So I think it's a really lovely sort of fitting tribute to him. So
That sounds really lovely.
So good. Oh, that's part one.
I actually love the sound of that. I think we sort of skipped over talking a little bit more about Bill Fraser, because in the show, he's the one, if everyone remembers, who is basically just constantly questioning what Jock is telling them in their first mission in the desert. Like, we only have this many guys. What are we doing? And just Jock ends up getting up in his face at one point. And then later on, he gets chosen to lead a little squad of his own, because the point of the SAS is for people to ask questions and not just take orders without asking why and that sort of thing. So he's definitely a character that stands out in the series. And Mart will remember that I kept referring to him as Negative Nancy, but I did really enjoy him. I think it would be cool to learn more about him.
I didn't really like him as much when I watched the series the first time, but when I rewatched for this recording of the podcast, I really like this guy.
Yeah, he's great. And I think in real life he was quite an experienced soldier. And then in the later parts, the Italy and France, he takes a really strong sort of leadership role. So he's quite an interesting guy. I'd like to see if the series sort of gives him even more to do as it progresses. what have I got next? I've got memoirs. I've got 2 memoirs out of several, and I'm so good. So
a very, very loose definition of the word several.
So the very first one that I ever read, and it's the first thing I think I read after I read SAS Rogue Heroes, is one of the originals, which is by Johnny Cooper. And so this book, it's a really small little book, but it is his memoirs from joining up, all the way through to his later career post-war. So it goes up to, I think, 1966 or 1967, which is when he effectively retired. And what's lovely here is that it's very funny. It's, it doesn't go into great depth about what happened, but it's full of like his observations. And the other lovely thing about it is you can chart his relationship with Reg Seekings through it. So they start off quite different characters, quite antagonistic, and by the end of it, they are completely inseparable, to the point that the book is actually dedicated to the originals and especially Reg Seekings. And the other nice thing about this is that you can tell throughout the regard that he has for David Stirling. I think even in the beginning of the book, he says he'd sent a draft to Stirling, and it was with his encouragement that he sort of felt able to put this together, and that it was something worthwhile he was doing, and that he regretted that Stirling, I think, passed away before the book was published. So again, I love to see the stories of people. And so even in the creation of the memoir, before all the content of it, I think it's a wonderful thing. The next memoir I've got is called Parachute Padre. It's by Fraser McCluskey, who we've not met in the series. I don't think we're going to meet in season 2 unless it goes into France. But he was the chaplain for the 1st SAS Regiment. And so he joins them in France. And it's just a history of who he was, what he did in France, what he did sort of slightly post-war, some observations about the men, and particularly there's a chapter called Paddy. Guess who that's about? And
No clue.
No clue who that's about. And again, it's lovely because it is so personal. And Fraser McCluskey, I think he was also the chaplain the gentleman who conducted Paddy's funeral when he died in 1955. So again, this personal history is, it makes my heart hurt in a good and a bad way. But, I love it.
This is really, the way you're describing these, they really sound like my genre of memoir. I find, particularly with World War II memoirs, anyone could write one and anyone did. So there's tons of them out there, and they run the gamut from maybe you shouldn't have got this published to, oh my goodness, this is one of the best things I've ever read. And my favorite war memoir is Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie. And those are the same kind of vibes. Instead of being about, kind of troop movements and specifically like where we were, what we were doing, it's a lot more about like relationships and kind of personal anecdotes and that kind of stuff. And to me, that's far more interesting to parse and go through.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think either of these men write like Leckie does, but that I don't think detracts at all, because it still is very personal. Like, you aren't going to look through either of them and get a timeline exactly of everything that goes on, but you don't.
Right. And I think also we don't very often get stories from chaplains in war media, so I'm really interested in learning about them to begin with.
Right. He also wrote another book which is more about his life called, I think it's called The Cloud and the Fire. There's me sneaking in another one. Let's do start with Parachute Padre. Biographies was my hardest category. Okay.
Oh, I bet.
And I have absolutely played favourites, and I will not be ashamed to say so. There are several biographies of Paddy Mayne out there. I think the Hamish Ross biography of Paddy Mayne, which I don't want to shill for necessarily, but it is 0 pence on Kindle Unlimited. I just think it's the best biography out there of Paddy Mayne. What I like about it is that it goes into sort of details, not just of like, all the standard biography stuff about who he was, what happened and so on, but also where the stories about Paddy Mayne may have been embellished and where people got previous conclusions from. So, for instance, he talks a bit about the story about Stirling finding Paddy Mayne in prison and how that telling has sort of changed through different accounts and biographies to where he's trying to find the truth of it. And the other one he talks about is the report of the game that Paddy was playing with Owen McGonagall that was interrupted, led to him attacking the commanding officer. He sort of gives details around that. So it's really interesting to see sort of where the stories might have a kernel of truth and where they've been embellished. So that's a great fun thing about the Hamish Ross biography.
That sounds like your book about Violet Zebo. There's a little bit of fact-checking in there about earlier books and earlier publications and stuff. That's cool.
Yeah, especially when you have figures who are so well known and there's just been tons and tons written about them. And sometimes there's a book that's considered to be the book on them, which was in the case with Violet Sabo. And then, 40 years later, you come along and you're like, I don't know, maybe not some of this. So yeah, I do really enjoy that too. I always think it's cool to find what newer historians have been able to dig up.
Absolutely. How many more do I have? So many. So my other one, again, playing favorites, but a few of the biographies have been written by family members, and they're all wonderful. There's a Jock Lewis one, there's Jim Ullman's one. My personal favorite one is Special Forces Brothers-in-Arms, and it's about Owen McGonigal, or Ian McGonigal, as I believe they pronounced it, and I've definitely slipped up throughout this podcast and not referred to real life Owen McGonigal as Ian.
I definitely call him Owen every single time because that's what they call him in the show, but
it's what they call him in the show. This book says Ian. I was at the top of this, I was like, I'm gonna definitely remember to switch back depending on which guy we're talking about, and I just didn't. Never.
Question, can it be a thing of some of them being Irish and others not being Irish? Could that be some confusion about the pronunciation?
Well, the Owens I've known in my life have also been known as Owen.
Same.
So it's legitimate pronunciation.
Right.
But in the actually front of this book, I realized that it says Owen, pronounced Ian as a family quirk, I think he says. But it's written by Patrick McGonigal, and he was Ambrose's grandson. So he knew Ambrose McGonigal. He obviously never knew Ian because he passed away so young, but throughout he talks basically about family heroes, and so how he'd looked up to this guy who he never knew anything about, but he was sort of part of the family makeup. And this, despite the fact that there is like so much information in here, he reproduces reports and letters and all sorts of things. It all remains like so deeply loving. It's a really hard one to explain. I reread a bit of it earlier this week, I think before work, and that was a mistake because I ended up like crying on the train at 7, which is not a good look.
So Ambrose is actually Ian's brother then, I gather?
His brother. Yeah.
Right.
So he was very interesting. He ended up during the war as part of the Special Boat Service. I never remember if it's service or squadron. I always get the two mixed up. Yeah.
Right.
And he remained friends, obviously, with Blair Mayne after the war as well. And so there are some really moving anecdotes, including one really beautiful one where he takes his son, Ian, to meet Blair at his home, where he's tending his roses. And Blair comes out and says to the boy, "I've got something for you." And he hands him this small object. And it's the silver cigarette case that Ian McGonigal had taken with him into the desert and had carried on with him. So it had his initials on it. Yeah, everyone's making a face right now, podcast listeners. Everyone's making a face.
Yeah, that's so heart-wrenching and lovely.
Yeah, so that entire book's lovely like that. So read it with like tissues.
That's really sort of, I don't know. There's something about feeling that kind of sense of love and obligation to write this story and get it right about someone that you never met and didn't know, but they were related to you and died very young. And I don't know, there's something really poignant about that. There's a poem called Ypres 1915 by a Canadian poet. And there's a few lines at the end talking about the Canadian soldiers at Ypres. And this poem was written like decades and decades and decades later. And he says, "It makes me feel good knowing that in some obscure way, they were connected with me and me with them." And that's kind of this vibe too. It's like, these people that I didn't know, but just feel this sort of like warmth and connection with. I don't know. That's really nice.
I think it's beautiful. I think it's a thing a lot of people can really resonate with. I mean, that's why I guess family historians, do what they do. It's because everyone's feeling that sense of connection. And so this Patrick McGonigal's gone out and sort of built this whole beautiful book and history and got this picture of this man he never knew. And I think it's beautiful. I will start crying again if I talk about it any longer. So I'm going to put it to one side.
Next.
And we're nearly there, guys. We're nearly there. My next one is actually a lot more straightforward. So it's the men who made the SAS, the history of the Long Range Desert Group. There would be no SAS if it were not for the Long Range Desert Group, showing them how the desert worked, being there to train them in navigation, to help them by taking them places. And really, this is just sort of an overview of that group. It's by Gavin Mortimer, who's written a number of other SAS-related books. I did have another one about the Long Range Desert Group, but I have deleted the title of it.
I have one question for you about this topic. Where's your Mike Sadler biography?
I know.
Missing.
Where is the Mike Sadler biography? I did look for one, actually. And there's like one of those weird little books on Amazon that looks like it's an interview that's been transferred. I didn't buy it because it just looked a bit odd. So, there should be full Mike Sadler biography. He sounds so interesting.
Wow, George, sounds like a project for you to take on. Then you could be on my book rec list.
Amazing. That's the goal. That's what I'll write as like the intro. This book is specifically for being on Sam's book rec list.
It's strange though, because he lived so long, you would kind of imagine there would be a book.
I mean, I guess in some way it feels like the illustrated history of the SAS does some of what a biography would for Mike.
Right.
But yeah, it would be nice to see it like a full bio. Yeah, you're right.
Right, that was excellent. I say we get George on more often just to talk about books.
Yeah, what's going to happen is that I'm going to end up reading a bunch of these, and then I'm going to have 5 million more thoughts, and then we'll have to do another SAS Rogue Heroes episode, maybe when season 2 comes out. Now that we have reached the end, we should rate the show. And in keeping with our tradition, we are rating it out of 10 and rating it based on something from the show. So would anyone like to tell everyone what we're rating this show based on?
To be honest.
Should I? Sure. So what would you rate the series in the number of ill-advised digs at Paddy Mayne, including the use of Irish as a provoking adjective, out of 10?
Well, I will say, I think my highest rating so far, did I rate the Violet Zaba movie an 8, maybe? I think that's my highest rating so far, anyways.
You did,
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to rate this 9 ill-advised digs at Paddy Mayne, including the use of Irish as a provoking adjective, out of 10. I really enjoyed it. Every time I rewatch it, I find something else fun. The music is great. The aesthetic is great. I don't mind the historical liberties taken at all because I find it really pulls a narrative together that's fun to follow and interesting. And I also feel like it hits a lot of strong emotional beats. So it's really good.
So that was literally everything I was going to say, including the actual rating. So
Well,
I'm going to...
I can read your mind, as we know.
Yes. We're usually on the same page, except when we're talking about Pearl Harbor. But otherwise, we're on the same page.
I thought I was going to get fired from this podcast over Pearl Harbor.
Never. But I would also rate it 9 ill-advised digs at Paddy Mayne, including the use of Irish as an adjective, out of 10. For pretty much the same reason. I really enjoy this show. I don't think there's another show that has made me laugh quite as much as this one. And I really enjoy the music. And the only thing that I'll excuse in this show, because it's not as bad as in the Pacific, is the scenes in the dark. There are quite a few, but I'll excuse them just because the show's so great. So that's my rating.
Do I get to rate?
Of course you do.
Amazing. So out of 10, I'm taking a point off for those night scenes because they were not fun to watch because I was squinting at my screen. I'm taking a point off because Reg Seekings doesn't have a Finland accent, and I take that as a personal insult. And then I'm adding like 6 points for Mike Sadler, just being Mike Sadler. So that's 14 out of 10. Ill-advised digs at Paddy Mayne.
Checks out. The math checks out.
Well, I think that must be our highest rated show so far.
It certainly is. I don't know that we've had one rated over the 100%.
Over 10, no.
I might be slightly biased.
And the thing is, I rated Band Brothers pretty high, but we rated it out of 5, so we can never compare it to this one.
Well, thanks so much for being on our podcast, George, and shedding some light on a lot of stuff. The North African campaign I think this is the first media about it that we've covered on the podcast. So, and as we've said before, it's one of those ones that people maybe know a little less about. So you definitely provided lots of good insights, and we were super lucky to have you and your 5 million book recs.
I've had a lot of fun. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. You can also follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, and please give us 5 stars. And should we talk about what we're reading this week?
Skip me, please. Thanks.
What are you reading this week, George?
I am listening to The Six by Laura Thompson, which is about the lives of the Mitford sisters, who I sort of know little bits about here and there, but it's the first time I've sat and listened to a full biography.
Who are they?
They were sort of this aristocratic family from this time period. And so they were 6 sisters who grew up and led very different lives. One of them married Mosley. One of them, was close personal friends with Hitler. There was another one who was really communist. Like, they were an eclectic mix of people. And one became a writer. She wrote The Pursuit of Love. The Pursuit of Love. I don't know why I blanked on that title because I literally just read it. So yeah, they're a very fascinating family.
Nice.
How about you, Sam?
I am reading fiction for once. I'm reading Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. And he's the guy who usually writes those sort of funny erotica novels. You've probably seen the covers of them online before. They frequently go around and get made into memes and stuff. He seems like a funny guy, but also really smart. And the book is a horror novel, and I'm maybe a third of the way through it right now and really enjoying it so far. It gives me the spooks when I read it at night in the dark, which I like. So yeah, that's what I'm reading.
That sounds really cool, but not really my jam. But maybe.
I mean, the nice thing about reading a horror book is that there aren't really jump scares.
I guess I might like it because when I write, my best kind of stories are actually kind of horror stories. So maybe I'll like it.
Yeah.
Right. So next week, a little sneak preview. We are reviewing a Dutch movie. And that's all I'm going to say about it for now.
Ooh, and I'm really excited about it also because there's some Canadian cameos.
See you next
Thanks
week,
for
everybody.
listening.
Thank you,
Perfect.
George.
Thank you.
I just talked right over you there.
For shame. Bye.
Okay, thanks for listening. Bye.